right, everyone. Welcome to this second webinar of Creation Justice Ministries 2024 Summer Read Series. My name is Derek Weston. I'm the Theological Education and Training Coordinator of Creation Justice Ministries. The mission of Creation Justice Ministries is to educate, equip, and mobilize Christians and Christian institutions to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. Over the course of the summer, we've been exploring the themes of birth, death, and resurrection in a climate-changed world. These are themes that are familiar to those of us in Christian communities, and these are also themes that we find echoes of in the natural world. And we began our conversation with Elizabeth Rush on her book, The Quickening, in which she ponders her own decision to have children while witnessing firsthand the impacts of climate change as she joins an expedition to a glacier in Antarctica. And you can find the recording of that webinar on our YouTube channel. And today we'll be moving from the contemplation of death to the contemplation of birth, the contemplation of death, with our last best act by Mallory McDuff. Before we begin, a few housekeeping things to note. Please introduce yourself in the chat if you've not yet. Be sure to select everyone. Let us know where you're coming from. Let us know your name and where you're coming from. And we will have a Q&A session at the end of the program, a very brief Q&A. Please submit your questions via the Q&A function. If you will scroll to the bottom of your screen, you will see an option that says Q&A. If you could put any questions you might have in the Q&A function and not in the chat, that'll be very helpful for us. And this workshop is being recorded, and you will receive a recording, a link to the recording within the next week. All right, I think that's all of the housekeeping. So let me go ahead and introduce our guests today. First is Mallory McDuff. She writes and teaches environmental education at Warren Wilson College, a liberal arts school that integrates academics with work and community engagement. She lives on campus with her two daughters in a 900 square foot house with an expansive view of a white barn, a herd of cows, and the Appalachian Mountains of Western North Carolina. Her writing examines the intersection of people and places for a better world. She is the author of the books Love Your Mother, 50 States, 50 Stories, and 50 Women United for Climate Justice, Our Last Best Act, which we'll be discussing shortly, Sacred Acts, How Churches Are Working to Protect Earth's Climate, Natural Saints, How People of Faith Are Working to Save God's Earth, and co-author of Conversation, Education, and Outreach Techniques. In addition, she has published 20 articles in academic journals and more than 50 essays in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wired, BuzzFeed, the Huffington Post, Sojourners, and more. And we're also joined by Dr. Ellen Davis, who's the Amos Reagan Kearns Distinguished Professor of Bible and Practical Theology at Duke Divinity School. She's the author of 11 books and many articles. Her research interests focus on how biblical interpretation bears on the life of faith communities and the response to urgent public issues, particularly the ecological crisis and interfaith relations. Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, an agrarian reading of the Bible, integrates biblical studies with a critique of industrial agriculture and food production. Biblical Prophecy, Perspectives for Christian Theology, Discipleship, and Ministry, explores the prophetic role and word across both testaments of the Christian Bible. Her most recent books are Preaching the Luminous Word, a collection of her sermons and essays, and Opening Israel Scripture, a comprehensive theological reading of the Hebrew Bible / Old Testament. A lay Episcopalian, she has long been active as a theological consultant within the Anglican Communion. Her current work explores the arts as modes of scriptural interpretation. Welcome to both of you to our conversation this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The book that we're discussing this evening is Our Last Best Act, Planning for the End of Our Lives to Protect the People and the Places We Love. And I'm always interested, Mallory, in hearing from authors about the series of events that led you to write this book. So there's a lot of things that are included in the introduction that are about what led you and motivated you to write this. But I'd love to hear a little bit from you about what led to the writing of Our Last Best Act.
Well,
as I write in the introduction, it really was the sudden deaths of both my parents, 2 years apart. And ironically, my mom was exactly my age when she died at 58. And and so, but something happens like that. And at 58, everyone I know has had some tragedy happen to them. That's not unique. But what was unique for me was the opportunity to really kind of go back in time and re-examine my parents' decisions, most specifically my father's. After my mom died, and they were both biking to from a Christian yoga class for when she died to the CSA, the Community Supported Agriculture, the farm where my dad volunteered in exchange for food. Um, and, and she was hit and killed by a teenage driver. And a month after that, my dad sat us down, the four siblings, in the living room in Fairhope, Alabama, and said, "I want to plan my funeral, and I want you to know what I want." And at the time, we really thought he was just this was part of his grieving. He was in the best shape of his life. They had hiked the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail. And so we, of course, said we would do whatever he wanted. And he gave us a 2-page outline of exactly what he wanted. And it was a burial, without embalming, without a concrete vault, with only biodegradable materials. He wanted a pine casket that he hoped to build himself. And he wanted family in leadership of this. He wanted us to dig the dirt, to take shovels and put the dirt on top of the casket in the neighborhood cemetery. So we were like, oh, sure, we'll do all that, in our back of our minds thinking, oh, this is just him coming to terms with the death of his partner in life. And then he was killed 2 years after that in the exact same way, biking to this farm on a different road by a different teen driver under the influence of drugs. And so the odd congruence of their deaths is one thing that kind of gives people pause when they hear the story. And Fairhope, Alabama is a small town. They were well known. And I carried his directives inside me, for years. But in my final wishes, in my will, I said I wanted to have flame cremation. Everybody I knew was this. I thought that was like the most environmentally friendly, sustainable option. And as the years went on, I realized there were so many more diverse options. And I wanted the chance to revisit my final wishes and explore sustainable options, but do it that wasn't just about my story, but in a way that had meaning for other people. So that was the prompt for this 1-year journey to explore more sustainable options with the goal of looking at climate, community, and cost.
One of the things that I think is I don't know, it's hard to ignore it as you've said it, even as you've described it now. It feels like this is a book that was very much birthed out of tragedy. Not just the tragedy of your mother's passing, but the very similar way that your father passed. And it almost feels like without that really horrible circumstance, that there almost wouldn't have been the space to think through these kinds of things, that there might not even have been the impetus to write this without that sort of tragic narrative. And I'm wondering if you've reflected on just how much the tragedy of that situation led you into this direction of thinking about these bigger picture issues, and really wrestling with some of the hard things that you get into in the book, because it's such a jarring opening to the book as we enter into your story. It's absolutely devastating, and I'm just wondering how you've thought about that tragedy leading to this much needed piece of writing?
Yeah, I don't think I would have. I think I probably could have written about the topic, but I don't think the topic would have. I mean, it really became this act of resurrection in
Mm,
terms of story. So, I mean, so that's the difference. I don't know that like, oh, it's hard for me to think about like, oh, without this tragedy, I wouldn't have written this book. I tend to like flip that, like, because of this, I have this opportunity years later. I mean, this was not like they didn't die like a few years ago. I mean, I had the gift of time and the gift of being able to tell their story over and over again. I taught a class last
mm,
semester on death, dying, and climate justice, and I had no idea that like I would be able to share this story and this research, and that would enable young people to like talk to their grandparents about death and dying.
mm,
So yes, there. I think that the book was born out of their deaths, and the storytelling allowed me to basically talk about my parents, in a way
mm.
that wasn't just like self-serving, like um, I, which yeah, I mean, I have a now a 25 and 18-year-old, and I talk about my parents to them, but the book also, was very much a letter to them, even though that was kind of the undercurrent of the book.
Mm. Yeah. I think one of the things that maybe is one of those places where it's completely obvious once you point it out, but maybe goes unconsidered, is the economic or the environmental impact of conventional burial. I think that's one of those things that's just really not on most people's radar. Could you talk a little bit about what you learned about the economic, or excuse me, the environmental impact of conventional burial as you were doing your research and thinking about the book?
Sure. And actually, I mean, the economic impact of conventional burial and the environmental impact, I was interested in both. The average cost of conventional burial is $10,000, and my father's burial was probably a couple hundred because his
Mm,
friend built his casket. He put it in the back of a pickup truck, and he was very explicit. And I think in terms of the economic impacts, which I'm just going to play on that a little bit, that the our ability to be very precise in language with our final wishes allows those who survive us, the freedom to make decisions that don't cost as much money, and also that have less environmental impact. So just one of the places you can go, the Green Burial Council is a place an organization that has a great website that you can look at some of the stats around conventional burial, and it's 1.6 million tons of concrete from the concrete
mm,
vaults, million gallons of embalming fluids. This is on a national level. The steel, the copper, the bronze that are underground, and so those are just some of the impacts on land, on biodiversity, on natural resources, and what I didn't know, is that there are choices that have less of an impact than flame cremation, and so that was part of this research. Like I was discovering, as I wrote and as I researched,
mm,
which that was obviously like really really fun to find out. And there's so many things I didn't know. Like I had no idea. We'll get into it perhaps later, but that there's a body farm,
mm.
45 minutes away from here. I had no idea, and I've lived here for over 24 years, where you can donate your body for the study of decomposition. So that's where like research, when there was a personal narrative about the environmental impacts, and then there was this, process of discovery that felt, very relevant, particularly to my vocation as an environmental educator in teaching at Warren Wilson, which is, where there's 1,000 acres on the campus. It's a very small school, but it felt relevant. I was like, wow, my death is so connected to my values in my life. And that's what really, when I speak with churches, for example, trying to think about how can we connect our values in life with our death, like that, the congruence of that, it can be so meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. I want to bring Dr. Davis into the conversation. There's a story at the end of the book where you mentioned that a author and theologian has reached out to you, and you mentioned that you're kind of fangirling about this particular author. And then I believe it was actually in a podcast interview. You revealed that it was Dr. Davis. And when we made that connection, we thought, boy, it'd be really interesting to bring Dr. Davis in to share a little bit about why she connected with you and what was on her mind as she was making these connections and thinking about these pieces for both herself and for her husband. So, Dr. Davis, I would just love to hear from you about how you made the initial connection with Mallory and sort of where your thinking was as you were beginning to have these conversations.
Okay, thank you. First, I want to say that you mentioned that you were thinking of this kind of brought you from death toward resurrection. And the word that came to my mind, or two words came to my mind, it was a kind of redemption in some ways, of a tragedy redeemed. And I mean, I would read the whole gospel story as a tragedy redeemed. But I experienced it. You're sharing your knowledge, and I'll explain in a minute. I experienced it as real generosity because you would know better than I, but could it have been 2019 when we connected
Yes.
with this? Okay.
Yes.
And as it happened, so my husband and I were redoing our wills. We were sort of at a different stage of life, and certain things that we would have been concerned about it, and we were concerned about an earlier stage, no longer obtained. And so it was time to make new decisions. And as we were making new decisions, something that had not been at the top of my mind when we did our wills probably 20 years before that was what to do with our bodies. The last thing, we were thinking about what to do with other resources, but I hadn't thought about what to do with our bodies, but it's an obligation. It's a material responsibility, just like money or other forms of property. And by then, I knew that flame cremation was not a particularly good choice. That was what my parents wanted. And so I'd sort of, like you, it was kind of my default option. But I knew that there were better options. And there was not a green burial space, well, frankly, within walking distance, because I don't drive a car. And so, there are ones, I live in Durham, North Carolina, there are green burial plots sort of in the outskirts, but they're not accessible to me. So, and my husband was 27 years older than I. And at this point, he was already probably 96 when we were revising our wills. And so we thought, barring something such as happened to your parents, I was likely to outlive him. And as our attorney said, there's not a lot of time to waste here. So anyway, I was looking, and I had been spending probably 2 years looking for alternatives. And I did know that there was a different kind of cremation, so to speak, but I didn't know what it was. And you can't just look up on Google a different kind of cremation, whatever. You don't come up with much, you know. So I was asking clergy that I knew, and people kept saying, we don't know, or there isn't an alternative. And I probably know thousands of clergy because I've been teaching in seminaries for almost 40 years. And I was asking some of the best pastors and most ecologically sensitive people I knew, and I was coming up with zero. And again, this was over a period of certainly more than a year. And finally, it came to me to telephone Bishop Brian Cole, Bishop of East Tennessee, who was one of the people who sort of brought me into agrarian ways of thinking. And so I rang him up, and he said, I don't know the answer. And that in itself I thought was telling, that he didn't immediately have an answer, but he said, I'm pretty sure I know who would. And so he mentioned that you were working on this book, Mallory, and put us in contact. And you then gave me the word aquamation, which is perfectly well. It's immersing a body in an alkaline solution for 4 to 6 hours, and has approximately the same material result, in terms of remains as flame cremation, but then the pH of the solution is neutralized, and it can be flushed into the sewage system. And so that was really important to me. This has become much better known, as you probably know, because Desmond Tutu chose aquamation and had his website publicize it. This may sound, well, I suspect it won't sound so silly to you or surprising. This was an enormous relief to me. I was surprised how much it reconciled me to the prospect of my husband's death. That I didn't feel that, and he felt the same way, that we weren't just sort of facing a brick wall in which it seemed the only choice was to do something you didn't want to do. And that was going to cause some level of emotional pain for a long time. I could say much more about that, but at any rate, so you gave me that clue, and it turned out that North Carolina at that time was one of 11 states, I believe, in which aquamation was legal. I think that has now increased substantially. It's over 20 now, I believe. You'd probably know more. So, within 5 years, that change has come. And as it turned out, a facility opened about 8 miles down the road from me. What turned out to be about 6 months before my husband died at the age of 99. And the kind of pastoral attention that my family received from the man who had begun that, it's called Ends Well in Hillsborough, North Carolina. And when he came and sat in my living room, bringing us the ash in an urn a few days a few days after Dwayne died, I said to him, he was very skilled at just talking to a family who had lost someone. And I said, "So are you a mortician by training?" And he said, "No, I'm an energy guy." And he said, I was in solar energy. And he was sitting at a coffee shop in Pittsburgh, North Carolina, not far from here. And they were broadcasting the report of Desmond Tutu's funeral. And he heard about this and he said, "You're going to think this is really weird." But I suddenly knew that at that point he was not in solar energy. He was doing something he didn't like doing, which was flipping houses. And he said, when I heard that, I immediately knew that's what I should be doing. And I said, "That doesn't sound weird to me at all. That's what we call Etzba Elohim, finger of God." And but then he had to build the facility because there wasn't one in this region. And so it was a pioneering journey for this man to do in order to be able to offer this service to the community.
Wow.
Wow. That's incredible.
That's amazing to hear that story. Wow.
This is an unpaid public announcement. It's Enswell cremation, Enswell cremation in Hillsborough. So,
wow.
That's a beautiful story, and I think for so many of us who are wrestling with how to live well on this planet in the midst of our climate changed reality, to think of the anxiety that then as we get to the end of our lives that then rises up with thinking about how do we end life well, and to what I'm hearing from Dr. Davis is Mallory, you were able to give her that relief in a moment where she desperately needed it, of that anxiety in that space. What a great gift that your work and your writing has been able to be for that.
Well, and I haven't seen Ellen since Dwayne died, and of course I knew about his death from our mutual friend Brian. And I think what I was sharing before we started the webinar, that I was, as you said, I've admired her work, her writing, and seen her preach here in Asheville multiple times. But to me, what was so impressive was the short conversation, whether it was via email or phone, I can't even remember, but the quick pivot, like within, I swear to gosh, I think it was like, it was not even the next day. It was like that same day. And Ellen wrote back, "Well, I've talked to somebody at Enswell, and it was a very nice person who talked to me, and and this is what we're going to do." And I think, for me, that's like our capacity, to pivot from our choices is like, that's, to me, like that's a metaphor for how we're going to live in the climate crisis. Like, not necessarily as individuals, but as a collective, like how we handle birth, death, matters of life, birth, death, and earth. So that's what really struck me, and I'm just humbled to hear the rest of the story. As I think about the logistics of death, that's what with this course that I taught with my students this past spring, it was to talk about, like, so much of the immediacy after death is logistics. And our capacity to front load those logistics for the people that are going to be dealing with it gives them the expansive space to actually be in touch with the deep, deep emotions that are going on. You're essentially like planning a wedding while you're grieving the death of someone who is integral to your life. And so how we put those details, document those details and get those things set up really is that provides for that, redeemed planet that that Ellen was talking about, that new heaven and earth where we are freeing people to actually then grieve.
And if I could say one other thing in connection with that. So Dwayne died in a small hospice run by my university. And when Hunter Beatty sent someone to pick him up, Dwayne was taken out wrapped in a quilt. And everybody just stood quietly. And when Hunter came to my home a few days later, he said, I got the call from the hospice at 2:45, and he immediately then went to the facility. It was 2:45 a.m. And he said, and I met Dwayne at 4 in the morning, and I was with him until the evening. And so it's not just that the attention that he gave to us, but he never knew Dwayne when Dwayne was breathing, but that he spoke of meeting Dwayne and being with him through the day into the evening, and could tell from Dwayne's body something about the kind of person he was, because at the age of 99, he was physically very strong. And he could just, reflect upon that. And so it was very non-industrialized. And of course, there are logistics, as you say, anything has to be organized. But this is, of course, the difference between an industrialized culture and an agrarian culture, in which something is being done in community. And so it's a person who has died, and it's a person whom you are serving and for whom you are caring in the last time that anyone will be able to care for this precious person. And that was the kind of language he used, and the kinds of small actions of using a quilt instead of a body bag, really created a very, very different feeling for all of us.
Yeah. Probably not a surprise for anyone listening to this conversation that there's a connection to Wendell Berry with the title of the book. But I wanted to read this brief section here. And this actually is from the Right Reverend Brian Cole, who was referenced earlier. When Wendell Berry's father died, his funeral was called his last best act, Brian said. Our deaths could be the most significant gesture we make for the planet beyond ourselves. Brian shared one meaningful way to think about the end of our lives in the earth. A new heaven and earth could be a redeemed planet where God cares for both humanity and creation, he said. Our last best act could be dying in a way that contributes to the new heaven and earth, not a landfill on earth in a climate crisis. And I think those are absolutely beautiful words. And while we segmented this as, we're having a birth, death, resurrection conversation, it's very interesting how even in our last webinar, the lines get blurred. In it's not as compartmentalized, and this book also ends up being quite a bit about resurrection. It also ends up quite a bit of being about new life. It ends up being very much about a new heaven and a new earth. And so I wanted to just kind of read those words, which feel like an echo of the conversation that we're having. I'm interested, Mallory, in, Dr. Davis has helped us think a little bit about the juxtaposition between the conventional industrial ways that we handle death in our culture. And I'm really interested in hearing what are the most jarring or important things that you learned in this process about sort of the funeral industry, about what this kind of conventional industry does, kind of in the world or for our planet.
Well, the most important thing I learned is for myself, is not to make blanket statements about the entire industrial funeral industry, which I did to a funeral director who was being very generous to me and allowing me to kind of shadow her. And I made the mistake of making an assumption or a generalization. And she quickly, she reprimanded me, and accurately, appropriately. And so I guess I learned that lesson kind of the hard way. I think growing up in my household, my father was very much like his worst case nightmare would be having fake green grass around his burial plot. I mean, so I grew up, he built like a prototype of the casket he wanted, and my mother kept her jewelry in it. I didn't think about it a lot at the time. You're just like, oh, they're my parents. But so I was kind of seeped in the positives of family involvement, in funerals. And I think I had to learn that, just like students can't say like, oh, the faculty at Warren Wilson, are this way, that I had to be a little more savvy in how I talked about the industry. So I was upfront in the book about, here are the impacts of conventional burial. But I also tried to then look for funeral directors, for example, who were partnering with the conservation burial ground here in Asheville. So I think the industry has done a lot of harm. And moving forward, though, I think for consumers, it's really important that we ask questions and don't assume things are required, because they may not be. And so there are funeral directors who are partnering with conservation burial grounds, and these are burial grounds that that are protected by conservation easements. So the land is protected in perpetuity through legal restrictions on development. And here in Asheville, there are some funeral homes that are like giving reduced rates for transportation of the body, because once they get to the burial ground, the funeral home doesn't have to do anything. The staff at the conservation burial ground takes care of it. Here in North Carolina, Blue Stem is a relatively new conservation burial ground that's in the Piedmont now. And so I think the one thing that I learned is that it's so important when interfacing with funeral homes to ask for what you want and educate yourself. The conventional wisdom that you'll hear from organizations like the Funeral Consumers Alliance is, if you ask for a price at one funeral home, go a mile down the road and you might find a cheaper deal. So the importance of that, though, is that you can't do that like right after somebody dies. Few people have that capacity to like price shop when you're trying to figure out, what to do. But the reality is, funeral homes you don't have to have a funeral home involved. But if you do, you can ask for what you need. So, for example, I took my class this past spring to a funeral home because I didn't want to just show them, all these alternatives. I wanted them to sit in a conventional funeral home and hear from the staff. And what they heard was some family values, like this wanting to take care of the family. It was things that I think surprised them because they were like me when I was, making generalizations. But there are funeral homes, as I've said, that are partnering with some of these more green alternatives, and that's important. It's important to know that embalming is not required by any state in the country. It's important to know that you can buy a casket at Costco. You can make it yourself. You don't have to buy one from a funeral home. And that there are options such as aquamation, the body farms, other options that I certainly had not considered prior to this book.
If I could add something to that, I think it is a really good idea to think in terms of a partnership. One doesn't usually know the circumstances of a death in advance, and often you don't know the timing. And so, for instance, if Dwayne had died on a weekend, we would have had to find a place for his body to be kept in the interim period. That didn't happen, but it could have happened. And I did find, I went to a local funeral home in our neighborhood and I said, I don't want a burial, but I do need to know how, what I would do when he dies. And they were wonderfully helpful, and they are willing to, at least the one in my neighborhood, they're willing to do exactly what you need and no further. And I found that entirely satisfactory. And they say it's helpful if you can in advance sort of fill out the wishes that you have, so then when they get a call, they know exactly what to do. And as I said, it didn't turn out that we needed it, but I knew that I had that as a backup if suddenly in the middle of the night at home, I needed to phone somebody. And I'll also say that I mentioned that I had difficulty finding a clergy person who could help me with this. And I finally said to one of them, someone I've known for decades, and she's one of the best priests I know. And I said, no offense, but why don't you know? And she said, because people don't ever ask in advance. I'm dealing with this 15 minutes to an hour following a death. The family is traumatized, and a decision has to be made in the next 10 minutes. And so I've never had occasion to do the research. I've now told my bishop and priests what I found, because I think if it took me 2 years to finally speak to you, Mallory, then I can at least save others who share the concern. I can share some of the knowledge.
Well, and my hope is that, and I've talked about this with Brian, is that we could provide some training for seminarians, even if it was just like a workshop or a talk, something so that's like, here's the options, because clergy are on the front lines of these decisions.
We've done it at Duke, and my bishop has actually spoken about it at the House of Bishops.
Oh, great. Okay, great.
Cool. You touched on it a bit, and I've been using kind of green burial as a kind of blanket generic term. But wonder, Mallory, if you could, and we've heard a little bit about aquamation. I'm wondering if you could just kind of like just briefly talk a little bit about some of the alternatives, additional alternatives to green burial that exist out there that are a little bit more ecologically friendly.
Sure. And I also want to make sure we get to, I see some interesting questions too that we'll get to. So yeah, our Last Best Act, the book is really divided into chapters that each chapter is a different choice. So there's, green burial in conservation cemeteries where the land is protected. And you can go on the Green Burial Alliance to look up in your state, where conservation burial grounds are. There's green burial in neighborhood cemeteries, and that speaks to to Wendy's question and that's what I ended up being really interested in, because Warren Wilson has a cemetery, but the contract required vaults and nobody knew it because nobody does full body burials, very, very rarely at the cemetery. And so part of the book was me kind of advocating primarily for a burial without a vault, because, and so I guess my comment on that green burial in neighborhood cemeteries is to make sure you ask, because some of these small cemeteries have some flexibility. So look at if they require vaults. What I ended up doing was asking for an exemption from the vault requirement based on my religious beliefs. And they ended up changing the whole contract. So that's another option. Human composting is an option that is growing and expanding across states. And a company that's kind of been on the forefront of that is called Recompose. So that's another option. Body farms are an option. Well, we've talked about aquamation or alkaline hydrolysis, and another chapter in the book, really looks at making your own containers, whether that's a shroud or a casket. And there's a lot of options around there. So that's just, those are some. In the book, I did not, body farms is a form of body donation. I did not go into body donation to medical schools, because oftentimes there's flame cremation of the bodies, and I was not interested in that at the time, but that's another alternative.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just want to encourage people continue to put any questions you might have in the Q&A function and not in the chat. So we'll get to those questions here in just a second. There's a lot. I have a lot of questions that I wrote down, and we're running out of time quickly. And one of the things, though, you wrote at one point that your daughter pointed out to you that it seemed like you were being obsessed with death. And it feels like this is a very needed conversation that, because of fears of being too morbid or just our kind of cultural avoidance of death, that we're just not having these kinds of conversations. And I feel like there's a I guess I'm curious, as you've done this work, and as you have engaged this topic quite a bit, like, how do we, particularly people of faith, how do we bring people into this conversation that really needs to be had, particularly as we look at, I mean, we're part of, I'm a Presbyterian, you're both in the Episcopal Church. We're part of mainline denominations that are aging quickly. And this conversation is becoming far more relevant. How do we invite people into this conversation when it feels like we're just culturally very avoidant of it?
Do you want me
Either,
or yeah, I would be.
either.
I'd be curious to also hear what they've done at Duke. I can just speak briefly that I have spoken to a lot of churches in Western North Carolina, and I think people say like, oh, it's so hard to talk about death. We have such a hard time talking about death. But my experience, as soon as I start talking about death, people show up and they are eager for the conversation. And I keep referencing this class I did this spring because I was like in tears sometimes because it blew me away how eager these young people were to talk about death, because not just the morbid part of like, oh my gosh, I've lost someone I care about, but like death could connect to what they care about, which is community, climate, cost. So I guess it's been interesting to me of finding people, once you provide the space, people fill it. And I've done a lot of churches have done like Lenten series around death and dying, where I might come in and do something about sustainability, sustainable options. They do something else about finances, something about legal issues. So I think just providing the space is a great way to start.
Oh, you're muted.
I'll note before I say something about that John Hargraves, you asked a question about energy use, and I put in the chat what I found from the Enswell website about the energy expenditure of flame cremation versus aquamation. I completely agree that, of course, there are some people who don't want to have the conversation, so they won't come. But a lot of people do. And I have, in my own situation, I have the advantage of addressing a lot of young people who know that this is going to be on them, and they have to be able to say something about it. And I have the further advantage of being old myself. And so I can say, this is a live issue for me. And in general, I think there's, and I think you're suggesting this, Mallory, I think there's a measure of relief when someone says, I've thought about this, and this is what I have to say about it, and this is the difference that it made to me. And at least as much difference as it made to me, it made to my stepdaughters. Again, I think it was a really significant part of reconciling us to this death, which was in contrast to your parents' death. It's not a tragedy, but it's a grief you feel deeply. And so how do you anticipate that if as in our case, you have the luxury of anticipating it? The remarkable thing is that your father was anticipating it, even though he had every right to imagine it wouldn't happen for another 30 years. And that was a gift.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So I'm wondering, let's see, looking at the Q&A, I feel like maybe the questions about, I want to ask the first question about cremation. Cremation by combustion for one human body uses about 25 therms and produces about 300 pounds of carbon dioxide. Could you comment if you think it would be beneficial to purchase a carbon offset credit to balance out the use of fossil fuels?
I'm hesitating to see who wants to answer that. I think the issue of carbon offsets is controversial, like whether it actually does much good. I mean, people do it, and I think it makes us feel better. So, but I can just speak to that. I know it's complex and controversial about the impacts globally, you know.
Yeah, I think the one thing that we've learned in recent years is that there's a lot of greenwashing around the idea of carbon offsets. And so, the only thing I would add is to do some deep research around those spaces where you might be thinking about carbon offsets, because there's quite a bit of um, bait and switch that goes along with those things. So I think that's a subject that requires a lot of research. Unfortunately, because greenwashing is a real thing. Let me jump to Kenneth's question. As a retired Presbyterian pastor, I've worked to bring natural organic reduction, human composting to California. It is quote unquote legal here now, but regulations and procedures for this are going to take until 2027 to be put in place. And then companies need to gear up to offer the service as an option. In addition to Recompose, another Washington state company doing this is Return Home. I want to talk about this in faith communities and beyond. Any suggestions?
Well, and I think, you know, I've collaborated quite a bit with a company in Colorado, the Natural Funeral, that they offer aquamation, human composting, and green burial. And that's like a new model of funeral home that is really specializing in those three. You know, in terms of speaking with faith communities, I think the language is obviously important. And when I've spoken with churches in particular about this choice, I've often told the story of how the research came to be, the scientific process. You know, it started as a answer to what do we do in cities where we don't have the green space for green burials or for conservation cemeteries. So to me, that's really helpful to think about the origin of it. It's really responding to a problem of lack of green space. And I do think it's expanding across the country. That's how I've kind of framed it. I think when people hear human composting, they kind of freak out a little bit. And so sometimes just using, as you have, like natural organic reduction, but honestly, it is human composting. I've also shown, I mean, there's a lot of great videos that don't show somebody actually going into the machine, but simulate the process. And I think that's been helpful. Just, and they're beautiful facilities. So just to show the process so people see it. Yeah. So that's what I have to offer. And it's just so cool too, that like what your body could then help to generate the earth and to be, I mean, that's really cool that you can donate your, the composted remains to conservation projects or use it in your own yard. There's a, I don't know if it's Recompose or I think it's Recompose. There's a video that I've used that's basically a woman whose husband died, and she's outside in her garden and she's talking about like, oh, and here's where I put some of, the remains of John's body, and it's, these beautiful wildflowers. And so that kind of human story to me, like, personalizes it and makes you, it has been helpful to me.
Yeah.
Two things come to mind. One is Presbyterians might be interested in this, that people might actually be interested in learning something about how bodies were handled in the ancient world in the time of Jesus. There was, and we know the answers to that, and it was thoughtful, and you wanted your bones to be with your ancestors, and and they did secondary burial, and, so, I mean, there's much that can be said about that. But at any rate, some people, maybe Episcopalians wouldn't care, but I really do hold it as an article of faith that Presbyterians and Baptists would have a kind of historical interest in that, and that might be a way to kind of open up the conversation. And the other thing I think it's worth mentioning, and this is important to me for myself, Dwayne and I both made a commitment to Duke Medical Center here to give our bodies as anatomical gifts. And that is fully compatible with aquamation. And in fact, I'm working right now on trying to get the medical center to switch over from flame cremation to aquamation, and which is congruent with the university's commitment to climate change. But it's just one of those things that hasn't been revisited in recent years since that was an option. But again, thinking about our bodies as the last gift that we have to offer, my husband and I are both educators, so that's important. And what Duke does, the remains, after they have been reduced to ashes, or then the family receives the remains. Or what we chose to do is have the remains scattered in Duke Forest. So it is a kind of composting. So anyway, just.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I was having a conversation with a woman whose husband passed away just a few months ago, and she was describing the space where her husband's body is composting right now. And there's I'm in Baltimore, and it's a very new space that has opened for more natural burial. And she talked about walking through the space, knowing that her husband's body was contributing to this pollinator garden that was growing around her. And the space was an old farm that the people who are running it now decide to use for a natural burial site. And it's becoming this sort of natural oasis. And she talked about sort of the contrast of, she's a minister, and she's done plenty of funerals. And she talked about the contrast of the space of being in a space where you see life flourishing and growing and in some ways regenerating itself, versus the typical cemetery experience that feels dead, that feels lifeless, that feels solemn, and just the beauty of thinking about the ways in which our bodies could become gifts. I think it's a really compelling way of thinking about this. And so I thank you both for that. The encouragement to think about the ways in which we offer a gift to the world in this time of climate change, where we have to think about the ways that we are adding to this planet. So we'll end there. Mallory McDuff, Dr. Ellen Davis, thank you both so much for your presence here. Thank you for the gift of your time. Thank you for the gift of your perspective. I'm so grateful for your discussion, participation in the discussion. And if you don't already have a copy yet, you can order a copy of Our Last Best Act on our Summer Reads page at www.creationjustice.org/summerreads. We have a link through bookshop.org, so you can both order your copy of the book and contribute to a local bookstore. Join us next month as we'll be discussing Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart with author Brian McLaren. That webinar will be Thursday, September 19th at 6 p.m. And you can register for that event on our Summer Reads page as well. We'd also like to encourage you to check out our summer reading that our friends at the BTS Center are doing. Their next summer fiction book club will be next Tuesday, August 27th at 12 p.m. Eastern. And they'll be discussing the book Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. And you can learn more about that at thebtscenter.org. So again, Dr. Davis and Mallory, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for joining us. And we hope to see you all again here next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.